I'm here with William Schumacher, and we are going to talk everything fiber. So, William, what did you have for breakfast, man?
I actually had just coffee today.
All right. Well, that I guess isn't fiber, but it works, right? So anyway, we want to jump into a lot of this stuff. So I want to give a quick introduction. So William is the founder of Uprising Foods, which is just one of my favorite companies in the world, but very, very much on the forefront of fiber. So William, in quick 30 seconds or so, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So excited to be here and so excited to share some science today with the listeners. So little just quick background on me. Obviously, my name is William. I started Uprising about 3 years ago. I used to work in the consumer products industry at Procter & Gamble. Decided that I wanted to help people by fixing a very, very broken food system. Dove into the science of what was broken, how we could do this better. Brought in a lot of the things I've learned over the years from a biohacking perspective to build what is now Uprising Food, where we are reinventing the staple foods.
Nice. Perfect explanation. And to help people understand what we're going to go through today, the goal today is to understand something called the fiber gap. I would say that is probably the most important thing we want to get across. And I'll let you explain what that is. But just to give a sort of a recap of what we're going to go through today, really want to focus with a deep dive on psyllium. Okay, psyllium, you might know of it from things like Metamucil and things like that, but it's being more commonly found in various foods and various ways to just not just get fiber in, but get different benefits ranging from blood sugar modulation, insulin sensitivity, things like that. So we'll go into all of that. We're going to also talk about how insoluble fiber is a very vague term, a very vague ingredient, and there's a lot of nuance there that needs to be understood. So without further ado, can you explain what the fiber gap is and what we're talking about when we say fiber gap?
Yeah, the fiber gap is essentially this concept that the vast, vast majority of people, especially in the US, are living below the minimum viable fiber requirements. So that gap is essentially folks are averaging between 10 and 15 grams of fiber per day when they should be getting about 25 to upwards of 30, depending on who they are, what age they are. And 95% of the population is living below where they're supposed to be. That is the fiber gap.
Gotcha, 95%. All right. So when you start looking at the difference of what happens when people consume, say, 15 grams of fiber or 10 grams of fiber compared to 30, I know I've referenced numbers of studies within my videos talking about like specific studies from diabetes care that have looked at just increasing fiber to like 30 grams is a game changer when it comes down to glucose modulation. Can you give me like just even colloquially, we don't have to go deep into the science right now, but a couple of the reasons as to why that might happen, why people see such a potential metabolic improvement when they're increasing fiber?
Well, a lot of folks would call fiber the forgotten superfood. It's really a macronutrient that gets so little of the love. There's so much hype about carbohydrates, protein, etc. A lot of the conversation revolves around those macronutrients. But at the end of the day, fiber is one of the most studied macronutrients. We've known for decades and decades and decades of the various things that fiber can do. It's critical for digestive health. It has so many benefits, but in my opinion, a lot of the benefits are not known. It's just, hey, eat more fiber. Well, what exactly is fiber going to do for me? How do I discern which fiber to eat? There's not enough education around why fiber is so important, what it really does in the digestive system at all the various stages, and how it ultimately impacts your microbiome. And it hasn't really been evolved into forms where people actually love it. So you can tell people day in, day out, eat more fruits and veggies, eat more fiber. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't taste fantastic and it's not delightful to get your nutrients, you're just simply not going to comply, or very few people will. And so that's one of the pieces here is, as a society, how do we make fiber more enjoyable to folks and let them know what all it does in the digestive system?
Totally. Can you give us sort of a story of what happens when we consume a fiber and what it's doing as it goes through the body. Sort of walk us through the various, we eat it, it goes through our stomach, obviously small intestine, large intestine. Take us on a little adventure of what happens when we eat some, let's say, psyllium fiber in this case.
Yeah, so I like to oversimplify this to basically three main stages. And I think of the meal as almost like you're putting together a little bus or an airplane that is going to go on a trip. Okay. So when you put together your meal or you start to eat, you're really assembling all the people on the bus, the parts of the automobile that you're going to use, and then you're going to send them through on a journey. Okay. So everything goes in, you've decided what you're going to put together. Now we're in the stomach and we're like, okay, now this is going to start to be modified. It's going to start to be broken down to prepare it for certain people are going to get off this bus, right? And so as the food moves from the stomach into the small intestine, now in the small intestine, this is where a lot of the nutrients are extracted and they are passed into the bloodstream. So some of these folks are getting off the bus. And then after we move from that stage, then we're in the large intestine. And now this is the part where, old school or before we had all the understanding that we have today, people were just thinking, okay, that's the matter that needs to get out of the body. Well, nowadays we know, okay, there's a lot more going on in that third stage, that large intestine, than met the eye previously. And in fact, what makes it to this stage of the journey really, really matters for the gut microbiota. So how you ultimately assemble the combination of foods, nutrients, the little bus that's going to go on this journey really, really matters because you need to deposit to various locations in the digestive system. And oh, by the way, if food is flying through way too fast or way too slow, that is going to impact various processes in the body. And so ultimately, fiber and different forms of fiber affect how those nutrients get on and off the bus, how much makes it to which stage, and ultimately impacts the various biological processes that happen throughout that journey.
Got it. So, and this is where, say, for instance, the rate of fermentation or the rate of, let's call it digestion for very simple terms here, that's where it really matters, right? So different fibers have different sort of what are called polysaccharides. They have different amounts that need to get broken down by our gut microbiome. And just to sort of expand even more, basically that bus is going down into the large intestine. And then from there, it kind of sits there for a little bit and they kind of get off one by one in some ways. And they ferment, just like if you were to ferment some wine or, things like that. Like this whole process is creating byproducts. The feeding of the bacteria on this fiber is creating additional byproducts. We're going to talk a lot about psyllium today because I know psyllium is as something that you hold very near and dear to yourself and also your products with Uprising. But what is so special about psyllium and how does, or we could group it all together with soluble fiber in general, but I think psyllium is just a great one to pick on because there's a lot of research there. What makes psyllium fiber so unique for this particular situation?
Yeah, so we're very fanatical about psyllium at Uprising, but the reason is because psyllium does so many amazing things, and amongst the fibers, it is one of the most studied. There's over 1,000 studies on PubMed right now on psyllium that people can read. It has an incredible safety record, which is super important when you think about ingredients. There's a lot of trendy things that come here and there, but psyllium is something that has stood the test of time all the way back to Ayurvedic medicine in India. And it is something that is a absolute water lover. And that is super, super important because water plays a very critical role in the digestive system. It's one of the things that the body needs to regulate, actually, how much water is in the system as food is being digested. And it is basically like a super absorber of water due to its molecular structure. Now, again, we talked early on, hey, folks, a lot of people don't understand kind of, the basics of fiber. Well, there's so much conversation around, proteins, amino acids, and the chemical structure there. There's quite a bit of conversation around fats, lipids, the different chemical structures available there. But in the fiber world, we're actually talking about the carbohydrate world. So really, we're taking a step back to, okay, what even is fiber? Okay, it's a form of carbohydrate. What do the various different carbs do? Because as we know, some carbs can really spike up, blood sugar, can really wreak some havoc on the body, but not all carbs are created equal. So psyllium and fiber, these are a part of the polysaccharides family, which are essentially long chain carbohydrates. Long chain carbohydrates, also often referred to as complex carbs, are carbohydrates that when you get into the body and when you look into their molecular structure, they have a ton of tiny carbohydrate molecules all hooked together. And that impacts what the body does with them, and it impacts what those molecules do when they touch other ingredients.
Interesting. And a perfect example of this is something I've talked about on my channel, or beta glucans. And it's an easy example because I can paint a picture. Beta glucans are a specific fiber that you'll find in usually like oats, things like that. Some cereal beta glucans, you'll find them in mushrooms. And it's a similar conversation because it can be illustrated. Beta glucans, 250,000 glucose molecules that are bound together. And if you were to say that to the layperson, they'd be like, oh my gosh, that's so much glucose. That's horrible. Well, how these carbohydrates are bound together and how these molecules are bound together plays just a critical role. And if you've ever wondered about net carbs and how this plays in, people will look at net carbs, they'll say, well, why is fiber even considered a carbohydrate? Because technically at the molecular level, we're still looking at carbon, hydrogens, and oxygen, carbohydrates. It's just how they're bound together. So beta glucan, 250,000 molecules bound together. We just lack specific enzymes in the human body to break those bonds apart. So we don't have the enzymes to break those bonds apart to absorb the glucose, but you know what does? Well, it doesn't have the enzymes, but our gut bacteria have the ability to munch on those and separate those bonds and consume those fuels. So then we're not getting the calories, so to speak, but our gut microbiome is. And it's the same kind of thing with psyllium, just with different linkages and different bonds, right? So like with beta glucans, it's alpha glucosidase, or glucosidase, excuse me. That's a one that we have part of and we don't have another part of an enzyme. So one of the things that I wanted to paint a picture of too that you can probably expand on is if we take a walk back in time and we look at a nutrition label, we would see, okay, fat. We have just total fat. And then as time went on, they said, wait a minute, well, not all fats are created equal. We need to actually put saturated fat in there too. So then fat was broken down into categories. Okay, now we start seeing carbohydrates are broken down into categories, right? We see, okay, there's carbohydrates that are broken down into fiber, and then maybe it's broken down into sugar alcohols, and then maybe it's broken down into other sugars or other carbohydrates, right? I think we're going to reach a point in time where fiber is going to need its own category because now we're seeing fiber broken down into soluble and insoluble. And can you give a quick explanation of the difference between soluble and insoluble, just so people know that there is a very critical difference there?
Yeah, so 101 level definition of soluble versus insoluble. Soluble fiber is the water-loving fiber, okay? That is going to suck up the water, that is going to be highly absorbent, and that is going to be the fiber that is broken down and digested by the gut microbiota when it reaches that kind of last stage in the journey. So that's essentially food for the gut, as well as it brings water in, which is super important for the overall health of this tract, okay?
Got it.
And then the insoluble is not digestible. Now, it does play a role. It does help move things through. It does not necessarily create an awesome fertilizer or food for the gut microbiota. So they play very different roles. Often, though, in foods, they may be together, especially in plants, or they may be, one type of vegetable or plant may have more or less of the other. So really getting that blend right and getting, definitely enough soluble fiber to impact the gut in a positive way, but also just enough of the insoluble to, keep that bus together and moving in the right direction. Also very important.
That's a terrific explanation of it. And people ask on a low carb diet all the time, like, well, I really am afraid of fiber because eventually I feel like it might contribute to my blood sugar or might kick me out of ketosis. And I usually give a thoughtful nod to the fact that it does depend whether it's insoluble or soluble fiber. And the way that I put this is people's response to specific fibers can be highly bioindividual. And what that means is if I eat, let's say, a large amount of fiber, if I eat 100 grams of fiber, who knows? Maybe I will see a blood sugar response, albeit it would be very small, it would be low. And let's say Bob standing right next to me, or you, someone watching, or William, you ate 100 grams of fiber. Who knows? It might be a different response. And that's one of the great unknowns, right? So in the low carb world, people get very concerned with fiber because they're concerned that it's still a question mark. And is it still going to affect my low carb state? Is it still going to affect ketosis? And my default response to them is you can get a lot more bang for the fiber buck with soluble fiber than you can with insoluble. And simply because if you're looking at it purely from a digestive standpoint, that hydrophilic ability that you talked about, that ability for it to love water, is going to allow it to swell and you're going to get more of the digestive benefit. But also from the fermentation standpoint, you just arguably get more benefit from soluble fiber. So if you are concerned with counting your fiber and you're concerned with having too much, I would definitely lean in towards the soluble fiber than towards taking the risk with copious amounts of insoluble. And I say risk sort of with air quotes because I don't think it's an actual risk, but if you're questioning what it's going to do to your total carb level for the day, play it safe and go for the insoluble or for the soluble fiber. Excuse me. Now, when we talk about bioactivities, I want to talk about the bioactivation, and that is an interesting word. We see that different fibers and different polysaccharides have different sort of bioactivities. Like, what does that word mean? What does bioactivation or bioactivity mean?
Yeah, so bioactivity truly means that there is a known benefit in the body to a ingredient or a nutrient when it actually goes into the body. So there are active properties, there are end benefits that have been confirmed, have been studied. There are mechanisms of action that we know for sure are happening when this polysaccharide ends up going into the body.
Got it. Okay. So for example, again, I know a lot about beta glucans because I've just done a lot of research in that. Like beta glucans, the bioactivity that typically is talked about with beta glucans is going to be much more of an antioxidant bioactivity. So to kind of expand and I guess add context or color to what you're saying, basically it means that, okay, well, a specific fiber and a specific kind of polysaccharide or what's going to get broken down in that fiber in one food might have a completely different set of benefits than a fiber in another food. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest things that we really want people to know about the world of fiber, is that not just one fiber is going to be the magic bullet of the future of an optimal diet, because different types of fibers, when they go into the digestive system or when they get broken down with the microbiota, then they are going to have different benefits. And so some over-index on things like intestinal function activity, some over-index on antioxidant effect, some over-index on helping with diabetes, high cholesterol, some even have anti-tumor effects. And so there is a wide range of what different bioactive polysaccharides, when they end up being broken down in the body and the gut microbiota start to proliferate off of them, what ends up happening. So one thing we're a big fan of is, hey, let's get the basics right. Let's find a fiber or a few fibers that you are getting consistently that are going to give you huge bang for your buck. But let's also make sure that we have a diversity of fibers so that you are getting a little bit of what this one can do, a little bit of what this one can do, and you're feeding a range of different colonies inside the microbiome.
Interesting. And that's such a valid point, because one of the things that I've learned, I was a UCLA researcher that I was really good friends with, that I was helping him out with. He was working on a particular strain of lactobacilli, which was really interesting. And he kind of explained it to me like this. He's like, if you have a forest. Okay, and in that forest, you have a bunch of squirrels and you have a bunch of wolves. If you feed one particular strain of bacteria too much, or if you feed the wolves too much, or the wolves proliferate, eventually there's going to be no more squirrels. And eventually that's going to throw off the ecosystem. And the same thing kind of applies within our gut. More bacteria isn't always better. More diverse bacteria is always better, which is why I'm going to echo what you're saying. It's so important to get such a diverse amount of fibers. And people find a fiber that they like, they find one, and that's great, and it's better than nothing. But we also have to be careful because even really good fibers, if you're in gut dysbiosis, are just going to feed that, right? Like, so let's pretend for a second we have a battle between, oh, well, unicorns aren't carnivores, so I can't use unicorns. But let's say we have, or maybe they are, right? Actually, maybe that's why they can grow horns. Maybe they get that extra
little known secret.
Yes. So let's say you have wolves and mountain lions, right? And they both are competing for the same thing. And you just throw like a plethora of meat over to the wolves, but you starve the mountain lions. Okay, well, then what's going to happen, right? You're going to have like the wolves are going to grow, or you do the opposite to the mountain lions and those are going to grow. So now let's pretend that you throw a bunch of food out for both of them, right? Well, all of a sudden you have a ridiculous amount of wolves and a ridiculous amount of mountain lions, and nothing else can survive because they're eating all the squirrels there. So just because something is good in moderation doesn't mean that you need copious amounts of it. There's specific bacteria that we really want to aim to grow. And I talk about this on my channel. And a lot of times, unfortunately, I have to kind of glaze over it really quick because it's usually in context with other subject matter. But there are certain bacteria called butyrate producers. And they're like this coveted group of bacteria that produce lots of this. I'm going to go on the record and say it's almost a magical compound because the molecule of butyrate is crazy. So what is it about these butyrate producers and butyrate that's so special that we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head as far as it is truly a magical compound, quote unquote, because what we find in the research is that when you increase short chain fatty acid production in the large intestine, a plethora of good things start happening. And obviously one of those components is the butyrate production. So how do we get that? Well, there are specific communities or colonies, types of little gut microbiota that are specifically good at producing that, or that's what they naturally do when you give them the right fuel. So when we dig into the research and we're looking for, hey, how can we impact, people's bodies in a positive way? There's a few colonies that we see that specifically react to psyllium in that gut microbiome. So we've looked at the Bacteroides, the Eubacterium, the Butyrate, the Bifidobacterium, and the Lactobacillus fermentum, and even Lactobacillus reuteri. And these colonies are butyrate producers, and they really impact the overall butyrate level in the gut.
So what is it that butyrate does? I mean, it's a short chain fatty acid, but okay, it's sort of the end product of sort of the fermentation or the eating of different fibers from these bacteria. So when we produce these bacteria and they produce butyrate, I'm going to make it very colloquial. It's almost like the bacteria are pooping butyrate, and it's like whatever their byproduct is of the eating and the cross feeding that's occurring is this butyrate. And then what is it that butyrate, or what are we seeing that butyrate is capable of doing?
Yeah, so butyrate what we're seeing in the research is, one, it can impact multiple signaling pathways in the body. So essentially, it's going to signal the body to do various activities. It can impact everything from different feelings in the body. So, things like anxiety, things like satiety. It can impact the overall lining of the gut, how the actual the strength, the composition of how that those cells are energized and fed. All of that is impacted by butyrate.
Whoa, so it actually acts as a signaling device, actually signals for molecular changes and cellular changes to occur. That's really interesting. So, I mean, I know some of this is talked about with the gut-brain axis and all of this, with the vagus nerve communicating directly with the brain. But I don't know if people fully understand, because it's not talked about all that much, that fiber is just not there to make you poop. Fiber is there to literally end up triggering this downstream effect that affects what are called, signaling devices. So sending signals to your cells to ultimately allow for glucose modulation.
It's ultimately a cellular energy source, right? So people don't think of in the poo level that there's energy there. Okay, that energy source is really critical. Some of that can even impact muscle energy. So there are things happening at the end of the line, and what we kind of used to think like, oh, it's just headed out. There may be not much more that value that those kind of leftover particles could add. No. Those are being turned into cellular energy and then oftentimes recycled and put back into the body via various pathways that impact our overall health. So it's a very, very important function, and it's not just waste. It is true cellular energy.
Yeah, that's where when you're trying to explain this to someone, you almost sound like a crazy person, because like you're telling me my poop is energy, and it's not quite literally like that, but in some ways it kind of is. And the glucose modulation effects, which is a huge piece, because people that are, whether they are mildly insulin resistant, full-blown insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, diabetic, doing a ketogenic diet, anyone that is watching their glucose levels or is concerned with this. And the unfortunate thing is you might think, oh, well, insulin resistance, we're talking about a small population. No, we're talking more than 50% of the population, right? So like, okay, 1 out of 2 people needs to be paying attention to what we're about to say here. When you're talking about the effects of fiber, okay, for a perfectly healthy person, I still think fiber is obviously very important. But when you start getting down the rabbit hole of people with metabolic syndrome, people with metabolic dysfunction, I think it becomes increasingly more important. And this is where things just get confusing, because you've got one side of the equation, like with the carnivore community and things like that, to talk about, okay, well, fiber is not necessary, this and that. And I give a thoughtful nod to the fact that when people are doing ridiculously like zero carb carnivore style diets, things change in the microbiome. But there's a very, very, very clear line between being zero carb and having any carbs whatsoever. Because if you're going full-blown zero carb on a carnivore, yes, the gut microbiome does change to where fiber is not necessarily needed on the digestive side as much. That's a different discussion. But if you're just low carb and you're having even 10 grams of carbs per day, then all of a sudden fiber becomes important. It's a light switch. It's either on or off. You're either going all the way and committing to carnivore and going that route, but you can't be saying like, I'm going to have carnivore, have a little bit of carbohydrates here and there, because then the whole gut microbiome is out of whack. And the research behind the microbiome with carnivore is actually quite clear that it takes time for that microbiome and that diversity to restabilize, because of course the gut is adaptive. But I say this because with lower carb diets and everything like that, it's not so much just about I'm trying to eat less carbs. That matters, obviously, fundamentally. But what I think is very important is whether you are low carb, moderate carb, or full-blown keto, being able to get the glucose modulation effects is important. And there's 2 things that are really happening. One, the digestive piece. I mean, you're slowing down gut motility. You're slowing down the actual digestion. So less glucose is being absorbed from what you do eat when you have it with fiber. So you're attenuating the glucose spike. But of course, then there's the other side, which is this downstream effect where when you're producing more butyrate, then you're actually improving GLUT4 translocation. You're improving the cell's ability to suck up glucose. And that's exactly what William is saying here, is like, we need to be paying attention to this and not just focus on only the fact that it's bulk, right? And it's such an important piece.
And the nutrient absorption piece is something that I think is often overlooked or not talked about enough, in that the speed, we hear motility, or, we quickly gloss over oftentimes the fact that you want to suck up as much of the nutrients as possible, and or the beneficial nutrients as possible. And in order to do that, the fiber plays an incredibly important role, and specifically the soluble fiber that is bonded to the rest of the food that is in this digestive event. When that all comes together through the digestive process and it goes into the small intestine, it slows things down to a pace where the body can actually pull out the nutrients, and the dispersion of those nutrients, it actually enables it to be maximize what you can get out of that food. So long story short, combining fiber, the right fiber, with the other things you're eating is a very, very powerful strategy to maximize absorption, especially of water soluble nutrients.
Super glad you said that, because one of the common rebuttals that I hear a lot and people see a lot when they talk about just condoning fiber in the first place, say, okay, well, we're slowing down glucose. Doesn't that mean that we are like dragging out this glucose spike to a gentle bell curve over a longer period of time versus just a sharper spike that insulin can deal with? Like, shouldn't insulin just be able to deal with glucose spikes, and that's not really a big deal? Like, that's the job of insulin. And I always say, yes, that is exactly the job of insulin. The problem is that more than 50% of people are dysfunctional with that. So we do need to pay extra attention to that. And slowing down the glucose spike might give our pancreas just enough time to deal with said glucose spike. So that is a very important piece. But it's so cool that you mentioned the whole micronutrient piece, because that is a very big piece too. Like, people always say, like, they think they want to have the food get absorbed quickly. And a lot of that comes from the fitness community and the fitness magazines back in the day, talking about rapid absorption. We want rapid absorption. We want rapid absorption. There are specific times and places where rapid absorption is key, but rapid absorption generally implies that you're also getting poor quality absorption. Transit time, how long it takes poop and food to travel through your system, again, it seems to be a very fine line, right? It's not like you want food to move quickly through your system, but you don't want to go eat a burrito right now and have it go through your system in an hour. Nobody wants that. So
Right.
like, you want to have it just long enough where you can extract nutrients, and your body does a pretty good job at putting a brick wall up if there's too much of a nutrient, particularly with water soluble, right? It'll just urinate them out, because that's another concern that people have. Oh, well, am I going to absorb too much in the way of vitamins? Definitely not with water soluble. You're going to be fine.
Right.
So I really want to give people practical, sort of pragmatic tactics, right? I think takeaways are so important, especially with long form interviews like this, because it's not just like we're just stroking our own egos talking about stuff and sounding smart. Like, we actually want to give tactical things for people to do. You may not be specifically versed in this, because I'm not even well versed in it with the amount of times that I'm just like constantly soaking up these papers. But there's different times of day that we get different benefits from fibers and things like that. But how do you recommend that someone starts integrating fiber into their life? Like, is just getting it with one meal going to be okay? Should they space it out throughout the day? Is there a proper protocol for, say, hey, I'm going to increase fiber, I'm going to put a solid step forward to doing this?
Yeah. So based on my view of the research, I think that there's a couple things to focus on based on what we know now. However, there's definitely research being done in this area, and I think we need to stay abreast at what the latest developments are. So first off, from a timing perspective, what we see in the research is that combining the fiber, specifically psyllium, with the other food that you are eating is going to give you the max benefit. So they've done research where they gave people psyllium before they ate food. They gave some people psyllium with their food, and they measured, okay, what is the blood glucose response and how do these things differ? Ultimately, it turns out that when you combine it with the food, that is how you actually maximize the benefits that we talked about earlier, decreasing that response, leveling out that absorption of nutrients and ingestion into the bloodstream, etc. So combination would be my number one thing. Like, hey, you want to leverage fiber, combine it with the other stuff that you're eating. So combine it with your breakfast, combine it with your lunch, combine it with your dinner. One study I saw, they noticed that the benefit was actually stronger later in the day, so with the dinner meal, which was quite interesting. And still want to dig in and see, in other studies, hey, do we see that continue to happen? And we don't necessarily know why in that study it happened, but with all meals, ultimately we see the impact of fiber combination. Now, that said, I know a lot of people on this channel do various versions of intermittent fasting. So depending on, what your personal strategy is, I would first want to fit with, hey, what is working in your lifestyle? Are you a breakfast eater? Are you not? Are you an early day feeder? Are you not? Or, where on the spectrum of kind of fasting strategies, meal strategies are you? But at the end of the day, what we know is if you combine fiber with your meal, you're going to get the max benefit. There has been some studies that show if you do it in advance, like a little bit in advance, you will see some benefit, but not the same as when you combine it with the food.
Wow, that's crazy, because I actually would have thought that having fiber first would maybe like attenuate the glucose response more. But then you mention it, it's like, it's not like you just eat fiber and it's a glob of fiber, and then you eat food and it's a glob of food. Like everything commingles. And it's like if you were to eat fiber with your meal, it would make sense that everything would commingle more. And that then you're having these sort of bonds that are slowing down the digestion of everything, which is really interesting, especially if you're eating nutrient-dense food that goes along with that. And I'll expand on the intermittent fasting thing because I have a theory. It just coincides exactly with what you just said. Breaking a fast at the end of intermittent fasting is one of those unique times where you want a little bit more rapid absorption. It's a pretty isolated situation, right? It's unique because people are coming out of a fast. You want to maximize muscle protein synthesis in a very similar way as you would after a workout. And that's usually where I say, hey, break your fast with lean protein. Don't add a lot of variety right when you break your fast. Like that's the best time to just say lean protein, or if you don't eat lean protein, go for some kind of plant-based, shake or something like that. Just get your lean, easy to digest or fairly easy to digest protein so that you assimilate and start that muscle protein synthesis. And then I usually say, okay, then an hour later, eat a more robust meal, and then sort of taper as the day goes on. So more robust meal, meaning that can be your largest meal of the day. And then within your eating window that's compressed, then you taper from there. But when you look at that taper, if you envision high calories starting here and you're coming down and tapering as the day goes on, I usually recommend an exact inverse with your fiber when you're ending fasting, where you're starting low and you're ending as your calories are going down for the day, as they should at the end of your eating period. You should taper. You definitely shouldn't have your largest meal towards the end of your eating window because it'll mess up sleep and a number of different things. Not only will fiber be more advantageous for you later on in the day, as that study particularly suggests, but it also gives you a little bit more bulk with your meals so that you can get away with less calories and not feel hungry. So you're actually doing yourself a double whammy service there by kind of tapering off and then adding the fiber. One of the things that people talk about too is maybe sometimes they have issues with having fiber late at night because it might give them some gas and bloating and things like that throughout the night. The bottom line is that once your body adapts to that, that's not going to happen anymore. So don't be totally freaked out when it happens. Like if you say being like, okay, I'm gonna go up to 30 or 40 grams of fiber and I'm gonna have it all at night before bed. Well, you can expect you'll probably be bloated and have some gas and you might be forced to sleep outside for a couple of nights depending on your family situation. But it's that'll balance out.
Yeah, for me personally, my own strategy for fiber intake is I want to at least have roughly 5 to 9 grams of fiber per meal. So I'm more in the camp of like, hey, I like to spread it out, make sure that I'm getting a kind of a dose here, a dose there, a dose here. Obviously, like I said, I'm huge on the combining side because I see how essentially the molecular structure and when these various fibers combine with food, how it actually impacts the digestion. So I really want an awesome combination of digesting food. And then of course I want, maximum absorption. And so, and in the research, there's been studies done that show different polysaccharides when combined with actually meat actually increased selenium absorption. And so there's something to, and there's more research needed, something to this idea of combining fiber with meat. And so for my personal strategy, I kind of cover all meals with at least a little bit of
Yep.
fiber and get that kind of ultimate combination. But I definitely think that this is one of the places we need to do more personal experimentation and figure out, hey, what is truly optimal, and how does it impact each of us differently?
Dude, that was beautifully said. That was beautifully said, because one of the things I've noticed, if I have like a fiber bomb without food surrounding, that is actually when I get gastric distress anyway. Like if I just go and have, well, it's a great lead into something I'm very curious to ask you. It's like if I just go have one of these, let's just call it a frankenfood, some of these frankenfoods that have like just ungodly weird amounts of fiber in weird, almost semi-synthetic forms. On the rare occasion that I eat some of those things, it's like if I have that in isolation, I am in pain. Like I am like pain hours later with not just bloating, but like just gnarly bloating. And I know people experience that, and it's like inexplicable, but it's a great, so I think, and then I've noticed in those same situations with concentrated amounts of fiber, when they're with meals, it's much better. So even the drawbacks of adding fiber, which are very minuscule if you ask me, are sort of alleviated when it's combined with food. But great transition. And okay, there's a lot of weird stuff out there. I'm on the fence with like soluble corn fiber is a weird one, right? It's like derived from corn. It's like, how is it respond? There's weird things that are out there, and people are saying, oh yay, fiber, let's create frankenfibers to like just still defeat, conquer this. What, in your humble opinion, and I know that you have a fiduciary responsibility as a CEO of Uprising, so I understand I don't want this to come across as like disparaging, so we'll keep it kind of blanket, but what are things that people maybe should look out for that aren't the same as like real whole food fiber?
Yeah, so here's a couple of things we know from the research on fiber. So first off, the viscosity of fiber is directly impacts how well that fiber is going to perform inside your body. Okay, so there's a direct relationship between fiber viscosity and the overall impact on intestinal function and all the various things we've said fiber can do. Okay, so this has been studied. We know this. So how do you get to viscosity, and what does viscosity even mean? And what's a kitchen logic way to know, like, wait a minute, is this fiber kind of in the zone of things that's going to do good things, or maybe do I need to do more research? Well, viscosity is basically, if something is low viscosity, that would be like water. High viscosity, more like honey. Okay. So it's essentially whether something, how it flows, whether it's more watery or more jelly. Okay. What we know is that in order to get max intestinal function benefit, higher viscosity is better. So how do we get there? First off, water has to be involved. The more it's like a gel, the more it's going to do the various things that you want that fiber to do. The more that it has been manipulated and changed, and the chemical structure has been changed with heating processes, with various things that oftentimes big food companies do, or food companies do in order to make it do something that is delightful to the tongue, or is delightful in some way, shape, or form for whatever commercial reason. Oftentimes that actually changes the bioactivity. It could eliminate the bioactivity. It could fundamentally change what bioactivity this polysaccharide is capable of doing. So what I say is, first off, less is more typically in food. Yeah. The more odd it seems, the more I want to pause and get more information about what is actually going on inside this product. Is there research on it? And what is the structure? And if that stuff's not available, I'm going to start to look at, well, is it viscous? Like, is it something that's going to be gel-like, combine well with the other foods? Or is it something that's hardened, shaped into something, and now it's meant to, imitate some sort of other big food item? So those are the things that I would personally look for when I'm eating other things in the market. And I think those are some good rules of thumb that people can use. Ultimately, the closer to whole food you get, you're typically going to be better off. Now, there's definitely room for, innovation in science and, bringing out the beneficial properties of products, but oftentimes the food scientists take over and things become about mouthfeel and lighting up the brain to make them more palatable, more addictive, etc. And so, that's something that people do have to watch out for and really read labels carefully.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I try to educate on this channel a lot about how to read those labels and what to do. And it's a perfect example of what you're describing is, if you take chia seeds, right? Chia seeds, you soak them in water, they get gelatinous and they get that, you can make a chia pudding out of it. And I think what you're saying is that even the state in which you eat a fiber can make a difference. Like if I go and I eat like whole flax seeds, it's going to be different than if I eat flax meal. And it's going to be different than if I eat flax meal that's been soaked, because I don't have enough time in my stomach for a lot of that hydrophilic response to happen before it reaches the small intestine and the large intestine. And I know that it's going to come up because people get concerned about the whole flax thing. And I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I'm going to mention it. Okay, with flax, the positive impact of the microbiome from flax, in my humble opinion, supersedes the potential estrogenic properties of flax, because when you satisfy the gut microbiome, there's something called the estrobolome, and the estrobolome is what metabolizes estrogen in the first place. So if you, or I shouldn't say in the first place, but one of the places. So if you have enough of this fiber and it's allowing for the proper gut health, then you have the ability to deal with those 1,7-hydroxyestradiols better. Also, the estrogenic components of flax actually bind to the estrogen receptor, blocking actual estrogen from binding to it in the first place. So we've seen this in breast cancer studies where they actually see, when flax is given, it occupies the estrogen receptor, making less of an overall bond from the actual real estrogen to the estrogen receptor. So pick your poison. Would you rather have a weak estrogen from flax bind to a receptor or a very potent human-created estrogen, right? So anyway, I just want to get that off, because people just, every time I talk about flax, they're like, I'm unsubscribing, unfollowing. I'm like, no, you got to understand this. Okay. So
yeah, the devil is in the details. And there's two things that you said that I want to make sure people understand better. So, first off, the form, the structure, like you said, really, really matters. For example, something that a lot of people don't know in the psyllium world, if you go online and you try to buy psyllium, there's multiple versions. Do I get powder? Do I get whole husk? What are the difference between these things? Psyllium is a great example where a little bit of processing is actually a good thing. Psyllium powder, it actually makes the particle size smaller versus whole psyllium husk. And that additional surface area, that little bit of processing, that actually breaks it down, makes it more gentle as it's going through. It creates more surface area for binding, which is obviously one of its key jobs in the digestive tract. And so a little bit of processing in that particular case is a good thing. With other ingredients, that may not necessarily be the case. And so really how the ingredient structure is manipulated with processing methods, and processing could be literally physical processing, like how it's ground down. It could be chemical processing, like how do they split apart an ingredient in order to get the different component parts. And those things change the bioactivity of the particular ingredient. So that's a great it's a double-edged sword, because it's a great thing, because if we're paying attention to, hey, how do we increase bioactivity of ingredients like psyllium, then we can get more benefit to people, right? But if we're not paying attention to that, we may take away or create unintended consequences through processing. So very important, long story short, to really, know kind of what has happened to the ingredient, not just that the ingredient is in the product, because that's a way oversimplification. Ingredient label, yeah, that's a great thing, but what variant of this ingredient are we talking about, and at what stage in the processing process? Because that's ultimately going to impact whether me as a consumer of this ingredient gets what I want done out of this ingredient.
Yeah, that's a super good point. And we have to remember that what the FDA calls a fiber is technically what is called a fermentable demonstrable. Okay, so, and when they do that, when they look at how many grams of fiber is in something, they say how many grams of this fermentable demonstrable is there. And just to use as an example, let's say we took a look at psyllium. If like psyllium, you say, well, there's X amount of grams of psyllium, then that's X amount of grams of fiber. But if it's like whole husk psyllium versus ground, or whole seed flax versus ground, or whole seed chia versus ground, that's where there's nuance with how many grams of fiber are in something versus what it's actually doing in your body. Because in order to get that fiber stamp of approval on a nutrition label, all it has to be is a fermentable demonstrable. And that's where food scientists can also go crazy, be like, as long as it's a fermentable demonstrable, as long as, and that just means if it's something that gets broken down by fermentation. As long as it gets broken down by fermentation, I don't care if it's plastic and cheese whiz combined together. You know, if it's a fermentable demonstrable, it's a fiber, and it gets us away from the whole food discussion. Okay, so something that you know, as a takeaway, as a practical takeaway, like, what would you say your 3 favorite fiber-rich foods are? Like, just so that people have maybe an idea of what you like and what you consider to be good and high in fiber.
Yeah, so I'll give you one that's not going to surprise you. Obviously, psyllium. Huge fan of psyllium. 2, I will go chia. Again, a similar food to psyllium, has the gelatinous properties, a lot of bioactive properties that have been studied and proven. And then I'm going to give you a third one that's a bit of a curveball, which is collagen, which I know is not technically a fiber, but it is actually a protein polysaccharide, and it actually is similar in structure to a fiber. And so I would call it the fiber of the protein world. And so those 3 would be my favorite fibers, and that I personally eat a lot and really believe in the power of their benefits.
I guess it makes sense while I'm literally drinking bone broth, so lots of collagen. So glad to hear you say that. So I guess people probably want to know mine too. The one that we share is definitely psyllium. I'm a huge fan of psyllium. Secondly, I'd probably take flax over chia. I like chia, but I take flax just because I'm just probably because I buried myself in research for about 6 months on flax, and I became obsessed with it for a little while. So I have a little bit of confirmation bias there. And then thirdly, I'd probably say either asparagus or artichoke, like those very long chain inulins, specific kinds of soluble fiber. That's why, like, you know, if you kind of like, or artichoke gets that like kind of jelly kind of like feeling, like when you scrape it with your teeth and you get like that paste that's like, if it lets it soak in your mouth, it'll actually swell up with water. So I'm just a big fan of that. But I think I like eating asparagus better than I like eating artichokes. Just frustrate me because I feel like I want more out of this, you know, but
Agreed. So Thomas, I've got a question for you. What are some of the things that you see people go astray or get confused on when they start a low carb or keto lifestyle?
Yeah, I mean, especially if we're talking specifically with fiber, there is a lot of research that suggests that over the first couple of months when you start a low carb diet, and I say low carb, it's not just keto, but especially with keto, when you start a lower carb protocol, there is a great deal of microbiome just lack of diversity. Things change. And then they find after about 6 months, things kind of restabilize. But there's a lot of nuance there because a lot of, when you look at that's observational data, right? But when you start looking at more mechanistic stuff, you realize and you see like what people are eating. You realize when people first start a ketogenic diet, they're usually like enjoying the meat, they're enjoying the cheese, they're having things that maybe they couldn't have a lot of before. And vegetables just aren't the first thing they're thinking about, and they're not thinking about fiber as much. They're also, in the very beginning, they're very concerned with every single carbohydrate. So they really get concerned, like, I don't want to have those nuts, or I don't want to have that, you know, that psyllium, or I don't want to have like things like that because there's a couple carbs in it, even if the net carbs are low. It's just when you're first learning. So I think the confusion there with like why there's shifts in microbiome is probably just because all of a sudden there's a radical decrease in what already low amounts of fiber they were already eating. So I really, really encourage people like, okay, especially when you start a ketogenic or lower carb protocol, you have to eat as close to the earth as possible. You have to find specific foods that allow you to kind of segue into that. Like, we're going to talk about like different forms of good keto breads and stuff, which obviously Uprising is one of them, is a really good one, right? It's like allows people to sort of transition, have those like bread-like substances, but they're not going to total frankenfoods. They're getting psyllium, they're getting the basic stuff that they need for that. Another thing is, like I mentioned before, this obsession with like counting fibers and like being concerned with that. Like the fiber is going to be your friend. Okay. If you, and I'm going to talk about vegetables for a second, and I know that not everyone agrees with me on this, and it's fine, but like if we look at vegetables, I would make the argument that if you end up getting 50 grams of carbohydrates from good quality, non-super starchy vegetables, I think that you're doing yourself, like whether you end up in ketosis or kick yourself out of ketosis or not, I think you're going to lose weight. So don't miss the forest through the trees there. Like people get so concerned with their ketone levels that they really do miss the forest through the trees. Like I'm not in ketosis. Dang it. Forget the fact that I only ate 1,400 calories and I'm losing weight and, oh, interesting. My carbohydrates are at 60. Everything's working, but my carbohydrates are too high on paper because I ate all that lettuce, or I ate all the chia, or I ate all that flax, or I ate all those artichokes and asparagus. Darn it, I guess I need to stop doing what's working because my ketone levels aren't high. It just, that's what like just blows my mind. And I was in that situation, and I cannot believe I used to be that person, right? So like, stop worrying about it unless you are doing ketogenic diet for a specific reason that you need to keep ketone levels high, like epilepsy or therapeutic use cases. You might be in a small box there, but that is such a small percentage. Don't miss the forest through the trees. I also don't think that having 50 grams of carbohydrates when most of it's coming from non-starchy vegetables, I haven't seen myself get kicked out of ketosis doing that. So I think putting an emphasis on whole foods and an emphasis on fiber is going to be a very, very good thing for people doing a lower carb protocol.
Yeah, we see the same thing. Like you, I talk to a lot of people who are on various stages of their low carb journey. And one of the things that breaks my heart is, when someone starts and they're super new to this, they're super excited, they want to make a health transformation, and, they take a few bullet points and they run with it. And it's like, okay, I got to get in ketosis. Carbs are the enemy, and I'm off and running, right? And what ends up happening is that focus, especially on total carbohydrates as the end all be all of what I'm kind of managing day to day as my inputs, and then the auditing of where are my ketone levels,
Yeah.
that ultimately lands a lot of people in a bad situation. Tons of people end up getting constipated when they go down this rabbit hole. Why? Because the digestive system doesn't have the foundational inputs to make sure that food is moving, at the right pace. And constipation is one of the, that is a very uncomfortable thing. But then over time, that is something that, can really degrade the health of the overall microbiome. And so, when people are new to keto or new to trying a low carb protocol, the number one thing I hope that they avoid is going down the path of zero carbs and only counting total carbs.
Yeah.
Because that fiber, like you said, is going to be their friend actually on a low carb journey. And it's going to be supporting what they're trying to do. And like we discussed from a just pure chemistry perspective, those complex carbohydrates that form the fiber, they are not getting broken apart in the small intestine and converted to glucose in the bloodstream. So, once you understand a little bit more about the science, it really alleviates some of those fears. And sure, everybody does need to, see what their own microbiome does when you put that fiber in there. And maybe for some, it has no impact on their ketone levels. For some, maybe it does. But, for most, if we think about what's proven, what's best for most, if you really leverage fiber as a tool on your low carb journey and use it to support what you're trying to do, get more absorption of your food, drive your microbiome to the best it can possibly be, get food through, at a timeline where that journey is aligned and optimized, then you're probably going to have a better shot. Now, test it on yourself, but based on what we know in the research today, that is probably going to be a superior strategy than just going down the path of ketones and total carbs.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, man. I always say chase results, not ketones. That's just,
Yes.
like there is a practical use for having high levels of ketones. Don't get me wrong. And from a performance setting, yes, definitely. But that's, again, very nuanced discussion. I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about Uprising, because we've provided a lot of educational value on this video, but I know people that are watching are probably curious because we keep referring back to it. Uprising, I'll just give my recommendation on it. If you're looking for something that is like a high fiber, super low net carb bread, but also they've got, I have to be careful saying this because you can't always like refer it to another brand. But one of the things that I grew up really eating a lot of was Gardettos, and I always loved the rye chips. And I can't say it's directly a comparison to Gardettos, but man, those rye, they've taken their bread and they've essentially dried it into these somewhat rye. They're not made out of rye, but obviously they're made out of psyllium, and I'll let you kind of explain. These rye chips that taste so much like that, it just brought me back down to like going on hikes with my family when I was a kid and diving into those Gardettos. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is something I haven't been able to have in 20 years. This is so good. And anyway, I mean, I cannot get behind your product enough in terms of just your mission, your message, taste, palatability, everything. But I'll turn it over to you because you're doing big things. You're not just like slinging bread. I mean, you've got some big things going on. So this is you'll share with us a little bit what's going on and how people might be able to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. I really appreciate the compliment on the product and giving me an opportunity to talk to your folks and have this discussion around science. Because at the end of the day, the big idea behind Uprising is that the food system is fundamentally broken, right? Big food, big pharma, massive multinationals are basically controlling 60, 70, 80% of those grocery store aisles, depending on what aisle we're talking about. And they unfortunately have kind of organized around profit and scale. Not like they necessarily are trying to do something terrible. They're definitely not. They're doing the best that they can in the framework that they have to operate within. But at the end of the day, it's about health, right? And how do we make society healthy rather than spending $3 trillion on healthcare? And so that's what we want to do at Uprising, is help people have access to the staple foods that power their health rather than take from their health. And in order to get there, we said, hey, we have got to go deep on the research. We have to figure out what is going to give people, based on what we know today in 2022, what science is going to be the Archimedes lever for people. What is going to give people the biggest bang for their buck? What's going to give them, the 20% of things that's going to give them 80% of the results? And how can we take all of that and simplify it down to something that somebody loves: bread, chips, etc. And so that's what we've done, is we have put something together that we know really tackles some of the root issues that are going on inside of people's bodies, but in a way that you actually like it. It actually is things that, creates memories. It, takes you back to, man, I used to love those chips with my family. Or, man, I really remember making French toast on Saturdays with my dad. And I want those things. And those are good things. But, how can we do that for people in a way that it actually powers their health day in, day out? So, we did all the research in advance when we launched this product. We even, went into, hey, what are the different chemical structures? What happens when you process ingredients differently? And we created our own version of psyllium, which we call activated psyllium, which obviously is based off all the research we talked about, from fiber to psyllium to bioactive polysaccharides. And ultimately, it's a psyllium that is designed specifically to bring out the most beneficial properties. And that's in our bread, that's in our chips. It's so simple. You just eat it day in, day out. And it's something that we're really proud to put our stamp on and, provide for folks. And it's really changing the game. We see health transformation every day, and I know you're huge on that. Is, hey, we want to help people along their journey to health transformation. And what I found working in the consumer products industry was, if you can simplify a lot of the changes into a product, then a lot more people have a shot. And I want people to have a shot at the absolute best life that they can have. And that's why we made Uprising products the way that we make them.
Very, very cool. And I mean, I put a link down below so you guys can check out Uprising for sure. You guys can, from a consumer standpoint, whether you're low carb or not, like it is absolutely worth a shot. Like their bread cube is really unique. It's a cube of bread, so you like slice it like real bread. It's really, really interesting, and its store is super simple. But I mean, we're talking psyllium, we're talking some egg white, just really good, wholesome product. I talk about living close to the earth. It's not processed, and even I call it rye chips that have some cardamom in them to give them that rye flavor. It's basically just the same bread, just dried. So there's no weird processed stuff. It's not a processed food. So really, really interesting stuff. And then, I wanted to give a thoughtful nod to, some of the raise that you're doing as well, so that if people want to kind of contribute, they want to be a part of your growth, they can be involved too. I know we have to be careful how we articulate that publicly and things like that. It's a very... there's a lot of rules surrounding how that's talked about, but I'll let you just kind of give a blanket statement. I'll put a link down below, and then that way people can go to that link and they can read the parts that are really difficult to say publicly. It's tough.
Yeah. So for any of you that are listening and are like, man, I really love what this company is all about. I deeply resonate with the mission. And you're like, hey, I want to push back with you guys and be a part of the uprising against this big food system. We create an opportunity for folks to get involved in a bigger way and actually own a slice of the upside of this entire company. So it's super simple. If that's of interest to you, you just go to the link below, or look for us on a platform called Start Engine, and you can find out all about the offering, what the opportunity to get involved is. And obviously, if you want to go all in with us, fantastic. We would absolutely love that. We want to, bring a village together around what we're trying to do and really build the community of people who believe what we believe the things that you believe, Thomas, and who are, day in, day out voting with their dollars around the food system and the companies that we want to exist into the future. And, if that's not for you right now, no problem whatsoever. We would love to serve your body, your gut, your digestive system with, an Uprising subscription. So, you can also just go to our website, become a customer, and just start there. Or if you want to help us spread the word, we would love that as well. So, we just want to be a partner in people's health journey. And we want to be a partner in the future of what this system is going to look like. And we want to lead a movement around a new food system. So, whatever part of that resonates with you, we welcome you with open arms.
That's awesome, man. I think, the idea behind this is lead with value, and everything that you guys do at Uprising is you lead with value. There's a lot of interesting information you can read. There's a lot of stuff, and they're all about just providing value to the body. And then when we say vote with your dollars, put that into context. It's so important. Like, if you continually buy foods, and I'm not even saying Uprising, if you go to the store and you start buying foods that have ingredients that I talk about on this channel, that have good things, it doesn't matter what agenda is out there. It doesn't matter anything, okay? Hypothetically or not, it does not matter, because everything is going to go with, well, people want this. People want this. And right now, people want hyper-palatable processed stuff until they realize that they can get good stuff that tastes actually better, is more wholesome, and arguably much better for them, okay? So it doesn't matter, low carb, carnivore, whatever. Like, when you're looking at the big picture, like, whatever kind of diet you're doing, even if it's vegan, whatever, you vote with your dollars for the wholesome stuff, and the food companies will follow. And it's, companies like Uprising that are doing this, that are changing, hey, let's like really drive a lot of education here. So it's just, I can't argue that enough, because I say that when I do Costco grocery hauls. I'm like, buy this product, buy this product. It's not because I have a fiduciary responsibility with them. 99% of what I talk about in Costco, I have no economic incentive to talk about. It's just like, go here, buy this for this reason. So
Yeah, I mean, whether you support Uprising or one of another 20 brands that you like that are small independent brands, you really are making a difference. And when those brands start to build up, their customer base and their ingredient buying power, they ultimately are able to make better and better products at better price points for people. And so I encourage everybody, like, try independent brands. You see an ad for a brand, like maybe I love some of the brands that you talk about on this channel and have supported them because I'm like, those are people, they're doing something different. Let's help them build their company up. And I think it's really important for people to, not underestimate how valuable and powerful their dollar vote is. It really moves the needle. And that's how we get to a different looking food system.
Yeah, 100%, man. You nailed it. So, well, William, thank you so much, man. And again, like, all the links are down below to check them out as a product, check them out as far as their raise, everything else. And of course, there will be linked to some timestamps and some references down below as well. So, William, thanks, my man. And everyone, I will see you tomorrow.
Thanks for having me.